Well, good evening. So glad to be with you this evening. My name is Darren Davis, and it's my great honor to serve as the director of the Institute for Faith and Learning. Also to have a chance to teach in the honors program here at Baylor. I have really been blessed with the chance to be a part of the Baylor Symposium on Faith and Culture since its inception in 2007. And this one is very near and dear to us in the Institute for Faith and Learning. They all are. But I think by dint of our own interest and sense of timing for this conversation, this one is our new favorite. And we're so thrilled that you're here joining us this evening and for the next couple of days. I should say just from the outset that the response to the conference has been beyond our expectations. Our registration numbers are over 400, and 107 institutions are represented at this symposium, which itself is a remarkable number. One of the great things about this conference, in addition to bringing the best and brightest minds from across the world to Baylor, is the idea that we have really some of the best and brightest graduate students coming and offering papers and seeing this as a sort of training field into their scholarly vocation, but also the fact that this is a conversation that is open and inviting to undergraduates. So we'll have a good number of Baylor undergraduates who will join us over the next couple of days. And then one of the things that we love is to have student groups come from other institutions. And so I know that there are some student groups from a number of places, but 3 places in particular I want to call out, and I'd like for you all to stand and have us give you you don't have to sing your school song or anything like that. We won't ask you to do that tonight, but certainly be recognized. John Brown from Arkansas, please stand. We're thrilled you all are here. Mary Hardin Baylor from just down the road. There we go. And then always a strong contingent from Union University in Tennessee. So we'll have Baylor undergraduates coming throughout the conference, and then our Crane Scholars will host tomorrow evening's lecture. In addition to all of these, scholars are coming from all across the United States, Canada, the UK, and even Africa. The Institute for Faith and Learning, the host of this annual symposium, was founded in 1997. IFL was born from Baylor's aspiration to pursue academic excellence, while at the same time affirming and deepening its Baptist and Christian identity. We work in a variety of ways to cultivate the field, to tend to the field here at Baylor, to do things that encourage Baylor faculty and staff to reflect upon and work out how Baylor's unique Christian mission and identity really animates, we hope, the life of the university, not as an add-on condition, but something that was really the beginning and the end of what we do and why we're here. So in addition to some faculty development efforts that include a week-long retreat held at Laity Lodge, to special programs for Baylor undergraduates and graduate students, the Crane Scholars Program, the Conyer Scholars Program. We're doing a lot, we hope, to prepare the coming generation of Christian scholars and teachers, and also doing a lot, we hope, to help encourage our colleagues who come to work alongside us here at Baylor. And we also feel a very strong stewardship to beyond Baylor. And I think this conference, this series of conferences that really began in 2007 as the Baylor Symposium on Faith and Culture, but go back much longer to first the Baylor Symposium that Don Schmeltikoff had the idea of, and then later the Pruitt Memorial Symposium. All of this, we hope, serves the larger academic community and especially the cause of church-related higher education in the country. So this new symposium that's not new anymore, that was begun in 2007, we hope engages the world of ideas in a way that recognizes the significant convictions, contributions, and sources of the Christian faith. And these topics we change every year. So we've done things on friendship, global poverty, secularization, human dignity and the future of healthcare, technology and human flourishing, educating for wisdom in the 21st century university, faith and film, the role of faith in sports. My goodness, that was a really important conversation that we had. A conference on the Reformation, on Soren Kierkegaard. Last year we devoted a conference to the notion of stewardship of creation. And this conference, which has been in the planning for about 3 years, is called The Character of the University. And what it wants to do, what we hope it does, is to generate faithful reflection about the project of intellectual, moral, and spiritual formation in higher education, and how such efforts actually require deep reflection on institutional mission and identity. The character of the university there sort of has two meanings. So we see across the country and across the world lots of really interesting work done on character formation and virtue development, centers and institutes and grants popping up, and that alone would be enough for us to hold a conference. But we have here at Baylor, we think, an opportunity through this symposium to draw people together to think about the fundamental task of higher education. The absolute necessity of the moral dimension of the work that we do. And how, as we're cultivating character, all of these efforts require us, as we're doing this, to reflect deeply about who we are as human persons, as community of scholars, especially those who are animated by the faith. I should say, too, that a special feature of this year's conference is that it is held alongside the 29th Annual National Conference of the Lilly Fellows Program in the Humanity and the Arts, which is a network of 100 colleges and universities that are church-related from across the country. So at 3 points during our symposium, we'll be in a joint session with the LFP audiences. We're going to have a great lunch from VTEX, get all your barbecue on Saturday afternoon, but we have phenomenal speakers for that. And when we add up all the institutions that will be represented between the LFP conference and the symposium, that'll bring that number to 170. And I'm not just counting numbers for the sake of counting numbers. I think it's a phenomenal thing to have people from that many different institutions thinking together about this really important task. Before I ask Doug Henry to come up, I want to just reflect with you about some of the challenges that we face in this project of the character of the university. It is for us, I think, a good question to ask whether the contemporary university is positioned meaningfully to cultivate virtue. I think all of us realize that higher education faces formidable challenges. Among other things, schools are expected to pursue cutting-edge research, educate students for global citizenship, gain recognition in rankings in the public eye, help solve the most vexing problems of our age, assure that their graduates get good jobs, raise millions upon millions of dollars, and achieve excellence in everything from the basketball court to the moot court. All I would say about this is not only do they have all that on their plate, but they have to do it while keeping students, faculty, staff, alumni, and overseers happy. And they've got to balance the books. That's a lot on the plate of the university. The University of Paris did not have to worry about such things in the 12th century, but you and I do. I think it's also a good question, and I know that a number of you will be taking this up, about whether or not Much of the language we use to describe our work in higher education is sufficiently rich for the task. That while we talk about being innovative and strategic and transformational, whether or not all of that language begs deeper questions about for whom, for the sake of what, towards what end. The language of the virtues invites us to think more deeply than some of that language, at least I believe. Finally, I'll say this. Your presence at this symposium is a real gift to us. My colleagues here in the Institute for Faith and Learning, Lori Knitz, Vicki Schultz, Matthew Bixler, Nathan Hayes, are here to do whatever we can to help you here, to make your stay as enjoyable as it can be. You let us know if there's anything in the world you need. I'll be coming back and forth between the symposium a little bit, some of the LFP conferences. I've got a golf cart to do so. It's gas powered and has a 250-mile range. So if things get tough and they say, "Where's Davis?" you just know I may be someplace out in West Texas, but the golf cart got me there. We take seriously that Aristotle devoted 2 books of the Nicomachean Ethics to friendship. We take seriously Jesus' words in the 15th chapter of the Gospel of John. We are glad that you are our friends, and we are glad that you come to Baylor to help us think deeply about the future and the character of the university. It's my great honor to introduce my friend and colleague, the person who preceded me as director of the Institute for Faith and Learning, Doug Henry.
Darren, thank you very much for your leadership and your framing remarks. So apropos, we're grateful. I have the role currently, which maybe Darren aspires to as well, of Interim Dean of the Honors College. I want to join my welcome to Darren's. It is our great privilege to have you with us here. My pleasure and honor here in this place is only for the sake of introducing tonight's speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Corey. Elizabeth is Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Honors Program at Baylor University. She holds degrees in classics, art history, political science. She's a lover of the musical and visual arts. She's philosophically minded, and as you would expect, her colleagues and her students esteem her highly because of her capacious range and her penchant for seeing many things held together. In addition to the work of George Santayana, Eric Vogelin, Walker Percy, Elizabeth has turned an analytical and critical eye upon the writings of Michael Oakeshott, whose interrelated and humanistic views on religion and aesthetics and politics she's treated in an excellent book and a series of finely wrought articles. With Patrick Deneen, she is the editor of the University of Pennsylvania's Radical Conservatisms series. In addition to Elizabeth's admirable record of scholarship, she's offered keen and often quite courageous commentary on matters of public life in such venues as The Atlantic, the Chronicle of Higher Education, National Affairs, and First Things, a journal whose interest she also serves through membership on the board of the Institute on Religion and Public Life. Her topics have included campus activism, tradition, prejudice, the university, marriage, diversity, love, privacy, play, delight. Quite an astonishing range of topics, each of them important in their own right. Recognized with several awards for teaching and research, she was a 2016-17 Robert Novak Journalism Fellow, and this past year served as the American Enterprise Institute's Values and Capitalism Visiting Professor. If you know Elizabeth well, you can attest, as I am, that she is devoted to her students, to their minds, and to their characters. One form that devotion takes is in her commitment to educating them liberally which is to say, among other things, to freeing them from various forms of captivity. She believes that liberal education should offer students liberation from careerism, freedom from consumerism, a reprieve from scientism, and so with any other diminished conception of human flourishing. She recognizes, however, that the freedom enabled through good education is never merely freedom from servility, but freedom for our highest creaturely possibilities, which is to say, as beings made in the image of God and intended for a greatness conferred upon us through cooperation with divine grace. If that were not enough, Elizabeth is gracious and hospitable, patient and kind, charitably minded, yet not indulgent of either bad ideas or poor practices. She knows that we, most of us, educators and scholars, ill fulfill our vocations unless we deny ourselves, take up our cross daily, and follow Christ. And in those familiar words, we should hear no pious nostrum, but the most deeply liberating reality of all. For Elizabeth's accomplishments and convictions and common cause in the work of church-related higher education, I know you share my gratitude. Her talk tonight is entitled The Adventure of Liberal Learning. As you come to the podium, Elizabeth, do so with confidence that we are ready for the adventure ahead.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thanks very much to Darren Davis and all the people at IFL, and of course to Doug for that very gracious introduction. I gave the title of my talk to Darren about 2 months ago, and I've kind of changed it since then, so I hope you'll be indulgent of me if I focus a bit more on the notion of liberal learning, the tradition of liberal learning. I'll still be talking about it as an adventure, and especially in a little image that I'm going to give you toward the end of the talk, you'll see that it was an adventure for me in a very real way. Actually, Darren has already touched on many of the things I want to talk about in this talk. The question, can the university cultivate virtue? The practical aims of the university. How do we manage those practical aims and inculcate virtue at the same time? Can they be managed all together? And the question of friendship and of community and of institutions, those all matter a very great deal. So I want to reflect on a lot of this evening. My talk is really going to be in sort of two parts. The first part will be sort of a somewhat philosophical discussion of the topics that we're all here to talk about this weekend. And then the second part is to give you an image. I often like to try to translate philosophical ideas into not exactly stories, not fictional stories, but I try to bring them to life in things that have happened to me or to people I know. So the second half of this talk is a recounting of something that happened to me this summer. So you can look forward to that. I will tell you candidly that I have thought long and hard about what I wanted to say at this event, because I know that I'm speaking to a group of people, all of you, who are engaged exactly in what I'm engaged in, which is the question of how do we conduct ourselves at universities. I know many of you have thought longer and harder about these things than I have, and I know who you are, and I've read your work, and I'm honored to meet you, to be here. So I hope this evening you'll think of me not as somebody who is here to give some kind of final word on our topic, but as in the terms of the science, as a co-investigator or a colleague or somebody who is engaged in a joint venture with you about the contemporary university. So who are we here this evening? Well, I think we're a set of people with a common aim: to think deeply about the character of liberal learning, the character of the university, and the characters of the people in it, both teachers and students. And I think we're also engaged in a common aim of trying to preserve the university, something special about the university as a tradition or a mode of activity, a practice, as Alistair McIntyre and Michael Oakeshott would put it. We certainly do differ in areas of expertise, length of career, particular teaching and writing interests, in the ways we relate to students. I'm sure that we also differ on politics and religion and hobbies in some ways, but these differences, I would say, point to the genius of the university as an institution. Universities have traditionally been composed of a profound diversity of voices, and their diversity consists not just in the standard demographic diversity categories of today, but diversity in fundamental outlook on the world and what is worthy of study and pursuit. So the scholar of early Christianity may coexist in a department with somebody who studies Buddhism or Hinduism, and the molecular biologist across campus inhabits another world altogether. It is almost as if university teachers and their students live out their lives in different modes. I'm borrowing this again from Michael Oakeshott. The scientists ask questions that are specifically relevant to scientific concerns of quantity and number. The historian asks questions that have to do with contingency and human action. The economist blends the scientific and the historic modes. The art and music professors work in a different aesthetic mode. But I think that we might also agree on a fundamental understanding of our activity as a whole, and maybe also the ways in which that activity tends to go wrong. Darren Davis has already alluded to this. I don't know if it's your experience, but it seems to me that much of our conversation in the modern academy is pushing us toward thinking about things in relentlessly practical terms. Maybe it has always been this way, maybe not in the 12th century, but maybe it has always been this way in the modern university. So this leads to us at faculty meetings not talking about teaching or scholarship, but instead retention. How to think up programs that provide new revenue streams, or attract grant money, or put ourselves in the national spotlight, or do research that is said to change the world. I know why all of this goes on, we all do. I understand that a university is extraordinarily expensive. I know the demographic trends look ominous at the moment, and I know that many colleges are closing or turning to online programs as ways of saving themselves. Yet I also think we would do well to remember the sentiments of C.S. Lewis in that famous essay which he published as Learning in Wartime. I'm sure many of you know it. There he points out that everything is always against the pursuit of liberal learning. There's always some reason to be found for not doing it, some political or social cause that tempts us away and makes us think that practical things must take first place. But I think I have to come down with Lewis on this point. There is no normal moment. And the pressures we experience, whether they're military, as they were in Lewis writing in the 40s, or political and financial, as they probably are for us, these pressures will never leave us. So given those obstacles and the fact that they're not going away, then what is it that we are really doing in a university? I imagine that many of us think of ourselves as conservators, people who understand themselves as transmitting some kind of knowledge as an inheritance to the generations that will succeed us. We must therefore believe that there is something, and something that is good, to be conserved and transmitted, something worth handing on. In other words, at the heart of our enterprise, I think, must be an attitude not so much of criticism, but of appreciation, of caretaking, of conservation. I'm not saying there's no place for criticism, but I would say that it may just be secondary to our primary aim, which is first to receive and to learn. The true critic, after all, has to know quite a lot before he or she can say anything that is worth hearing. So we might therefore try to cultivate in our students not so much the famous critical thinking, but instead humility and receptivity. We might think not so much of tearing down as of building up and supporting traditions of learning, of sustaining and nourishing these traditions rather than reforming and changing them, or in some cases, destroying them. So liberal learning, on my understanding, is a deeply conservative enterprise, not politically conservative, but conservative in the sense of holding certain traditions, insights, and ways of thinking to be good and handing them on in institutions like the college and university, and in the disciplines we find ourselves part of, and in the manners of activity we engage in that go with reading and thinking and talking, and with relating to one another. And I think these two understandings of university life presuppose different kinds of characters. I think it's a distinction between active and receptive virtues. Those of you who read the Chronicle of Higher Education will know that it is the practical and political voice of the modern university. And for the Chronicle of Higher Education, the most important things are always innovation, looking toward the future, change, and transformation. The traits we are told to cultivate in students are critical thinking, constant questioning, doubting and confronting and opposing and resisting and challenging and provoking and changing. At Christian schools, we might wonder whether all these things are virtues at all, preferring instead the theological virtues, which are indisputably more important. But in the modern university, these confrontational and critical attitudes do seem to be upheld as supremely worthy of pursuit. And so we read Plato, Aristotle, Locke, and Jefferson, not to learn from them, but to take them down. On the other hand, I think there are virtues or manners and modes of being that actually stand opposed to these kinds of virtues, and they are the more important ones. So let me just list them. What if instead of the confronting and the opposing, we instead considered and cultivated and deferred to other people and learned what it means to have Keats's negative capability and allowed ourselves to be quiet and listen and to be refuted and even to respect authority and to examine and understand traditions before rejecting them, if we do reject them at all. Ultimately, I think all of these receptive attitudes rest on a foundation of humility, which probably is a virtue that rises to the level of the theological virtues, or at least is the foundation for those virtues. So tonight, then, I want to try to describe a rather countercultural way of thinking about the university and of institutions like it, but one that I think would serve us well were we to mark, learn, and inwardly digest it. But I'm actually going to begin with a kind of negative and critical vision, the things I think we want to try to avoid. Darren has, in a way, already set them out for us, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about each one. I'll end, though, with this more positive vision so that you're not going to go home depressed tonight at the end of the first evening. So let me sketch out three kinds of what I would call misunderstandings of traditional liberal learning in our present context. And I think they come in three main types: the vocational, the political, and the aspirational. And I'll say what that means in just a minute. I think all three of these have in common a loss of confidence in the university's basic identity. We in universities increasingly feel and think that we must justify ourselves to the great and powerful practical world that demands outcomes and is constantly judging us. So we do have learning outcomes and metrics that are measurable. We tend to become obsessed with our rankings. We talk about job placement and salaries in the years after graduation as if this were the most important result of college. All three of these misunderstandings come about for predictable reasons, and there are reasons that each is so widespread in the current moment. But I think when any one of these or any combination dominates, then the most vital part of liberal learning is eclipsed. Okay, so the first one. First one, we all know it, and we all live with it every single day, is the vocational. This is usually justified by referring to the cost of tuition. In short, universities are thought of as specialized training for students' future careers. As countless parents have said to me, it was one thing when I went to college, tuition was $100 an hour. Now I'm paying $50,000 to $70,000 a year. I have the right to expect that my child will graduate and be able to get a good job. Well, of course, that's fair enough. And we hope for all our children to succeed and for all our students to succeed. But the problem with this understanding is that the pressure the parents and child feel for the post-college living makes its way into the college experience itself. So college becomes not something to be experienced on its own terms and for the potential transformation that may happen at college, but as training. It becomes essentially teleological. If it doesn't quite issue in vocational degrees like diesel equipment technology or culinary arts that we might find at a technical college, it is nevertheless vocational in the white-collar terms of business administration or electrical engineering or healthcare management. Not much more needs to be said here, you all are aware of this. And it's not a criticism of vocational education, which is certainly worthwhile in its own right, but it is not the same thing as liberal learning, which I think does lie at the heart of a university's activity. The second misunderstanding I'm going to call the political. Many universities have come to understand themselves primarily as political institutions. I see it in two different ways. One, the university itself, the Student Life Division, and many of its faculty see their jobs not as illumination in the traditional subjects of the liberal arts, but as training in activism, even at times indoctrination. Or, two, the university confirms students who are already activists in their already formed views. You can be sure that a Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies is not neutral with respect to political causes and social change. The job is to inform and train students so that they are equipped to become change makers once they graduate. and even before they graduate. And while I've just criticized the left on this score because I think the left has recently had a greater monopoly on political indoctrination, the right is now catching up. Organizations like Young Americans for Freedom and Turning Point USA have done a tremendous job of turning students into activists. These students now mirror those that the left has cultivated. We could debate the legitimacy of the causes pursued by left and right alike, but what neither the activist right nor the activist left does is educate for the sake of education itself. As activists, these approaches always aim at some good that exists outside the university, social or cultural change of one sort or another. They're pursuing things that require action, not contemplation, and so they require active virtues, not the receptive ones. The two political factions then mimic each other, digging in, aiming not at subtlety, but at provocation and war. And so the university becomes more and more like a cable news channel. The third misunderstanding of contemporary university life, and the one that very few people even recognize as a problem, is what I would call the aspirational misunderstanding. This is what we see when universities cannot be content with what they are, but aspire to be what the world wants them to be. Reconstituting themselves on the model of businesses, or getting caught up in the attempt to conquer the rankings, or become some kind of top-tier school, or to show how many of its students have won prestigious fellowships and scholarships. All of this, I think, distracts from what may take place in the fundamentally sacred space of the university, because the aspirations are outwardly focused, directed toward an audience. What we do in universities then becomes performative. We are concerned with displaying ourselves to others, competing to rise in the rankings, judging ourselves on our success and on the awards we and our students win. All of this reconstitutes the university and the activity within it as essentially competitive. And it is also, frankly, a prideful endeavor, concerned with honor and achievement above all else. It is usually excused in the name of pursuing excellence, but the excellence pursued in these kinds of endeavors is not intrinsic. It is excellence that we can post on our web pages and advertise in our alumni magazines. Our status consciousness as teachers and administrators may even become a kind of pathology, and it is a pathology we tend to pass on to our students, who are increasingly anxious about themselves, their achievements, and their identities. Am I valuable only for what I can do and achieve? A student wonders. My professors seem excellent, and they push me toward excellence. Is all of life about excellence, and excellence that is recognized by others? It's a very serious question for students and for us. Now, so far this talk has been pretty negative and critical. Don't worry, the whole talk is not going to be so negative. I'm identifying misunderstandings that I think exist in the institutions that have traditionally been the defenders of liberal learning. And I've put them into these three main categories: vocational, political, and aspirational. And of course, they're not strictly separated like this. Each university may partake in one or more to different extents. I said at the outset that all of these are concerned with the practical world, the world of getting and spending and doing and making and criticizing and achieving and being recognized. But what is the alternative to all this? Well, I think the alternative is to imagine our activity not in terms of work, politics, and ambition, the vocational, political, and aspirational modes, but to view the university in a way that is distinctly countercultural and may even appear impossible in our day. This is to view the university as a traditional mode of activity where we are handing something down to our students, and where what is prized is not so much critical thinking, but something like receptive thinking, or as some have called it, disinterest. Disinterest, of course, is not being uninterested, but rather that the interest we have in learning does not hinge on our own personal identities or our prospects for the future. I'm not saying we should forget ourselves forever, but I do think that according to a traditional understanding, liberal learning allows us for a time to put our personal concerns aside and to immerse ourselves in things that have long preceded us. Traditions of thought, of art, music, and historical understanding. Such an attitude allows us to focus instead on learning in and for itself. Think of the things that we sometimes teach to undergraduates. I mean, the list could be hundreds of classes long, but I just chose a few. We have classes in Proto-Corinthian pottery, Islamic art and architecture, Greece in the Bronze Age, the poetry of Emily Dickinson, Chinese calligraphy, Latin and Greek language courses, None of this is done for an extrinsic end. We might even call the essential core of liberal learning aesthetic. What does this mean? Well, to view the world or our studies or our teaching or a person aesthetically is to put aside our concerns with getting and spending, with political victory, and with getting ahead in some kind of all-encompassing competition. Aesthetic attention is an attentive, engaged interest in something that is not essentially related to the self and that may point far beyond the self. It happens whenever we act for the sake of a given activity, thinking neither of our particular aims nor of the activity's consequences. And what does this require? Well, I think it requires the hardest thing of all, that we not worry about our name or our brand or the mark we're going to make or the book or article we're going to write or our reputation, but assume the posture of the spectator, the observer, the participant. If there's any word that sums it up, I think it is receptivity. I dare say it requires humility. There's a wonderful quote that some of you may know from a 19th century educator by the name of William Corey, no relation to me. And he's put the essential enterprise of liberal learning in this way, and it's just a wonderful quote. He says this: "At school, you are engaged not so much in acquiring knowledge as in making mental efforts under criticism. You go to a great school not so much for knowledge as for arts and habits, for the habit of attention, for the art of expression, for the art of assuming at a moment's notice a new intellectual position, for the art of entering quickly into another person's thoughts, for the habit of submitting to censure and refutation, for the art of indicating assent or dissent in graduated terms, for the habit of regarding minute points of accuracy, for the art of working out what is possible in a given time, for taste, for discrimination, for mental courage, and for mental soberness." And so it turns out that I think certain kinds of virtues or attitudes are cultivated by what I'm calling disinterested or aesthetic. It's the list I gave you earlier: to cultivate, to defer, to learn what negative capability is, to be silent, to listen, to be refuted, and even sometimes to respect authority. A person who has cultivated these receptive attitudes can see his interests alongside those of others. Such a person attempts to overcome or temper the natural self-regard that comes with being human. This person may inadvertently acquire restraint and self-control. And because he's been free to enter into the complex worlds of other people, moral worlds of other people, he may also cultivate the characteristics of sympathy, humility, and charity. All of this offers a way of thinking about ourselves and the things we're engaged in at the university as part of a larger enterprise, part of traditions that precede us and that will continue long after we are gone. This, I think, is the understanding of liberal learning and of the receptive virtues that I want to describe tonight. It can only take place as part of a community of others who are engaged in what we are engaged in and who are above all appreciative of their inheritances. It also, though, depends on institutions of many different kinds. Now I want to make my turn and tell a bit of this personal story, which has to do with these same ideas, but it's not about the university. You kind of know what I think about liberal learning now. I've just said it. But I think this kind of understanding can transfer across different sorts of institutions, and sometimes very different sorts of institutions. So the little story or image I'm going to give you tonight has nothing to do with university, it has to do with summer camp. More than 25 years ago, I spent 2 summers as a camp counselor in Western North Carolina. This year, I sent my 14-year-old daughter for 5 weeks to the same place. Located high in the mountains near Asheville, Green Cove is an old-fashioned camp of the kind featured in The Parent Trap, where girls go for long stretches of the summer to live in rustic cabins and climb mountains, ride horses, paddle, and sail. The camp's buildings border Lake Summit, where water temperatures hover in the high 60s. Despite the cold, the girls have to prove their swimming abilities by treading water for at least 30 minutes. It's quite a long time. The camp has been owned and run by members of the Bell family since the 1940s. The current director is Nancy Bell, now in her 70s. Her hair turned white more than 30 years ago, really, making her appear ageless, since Nancy at 70 looks just like Nancy at 40. She's a bit frightening to the campers because she gives no hugs and no high fives. She's a benevolent ruler, detached and observant. The buildings at Green Cove consist of a main lodge, an infirmary, and a variety of cabins arranged in lines according to the ages of the girls who inhabit them. Most of the camp's structures were built in the 1940s and have changed little since then. They have concrete floors, screened windows, and bunk beds. They have no heat or air conditioning, and by the middle of camp, everything smells faintly of mildew from wet swimsuits and muddy hiking boots. For anybody who's ever been a camper, it's not an unpleasant smell. Things are maintained but never much improved. The institution rejoices in being what it is. There's no need for Wi-Fi, paved walkways, or greater efficiency in food delivery. The camp radiates warmth in its untidiness, and nobody presses for renovation. When I was there in the early 1990s, it looked exactly as it does today. Even more important than Green Cove's unchanging physical structures are its unchanging customs. Though the camp is not religious, it resembles a thriving religious institution. Distinct roles for everybody, levels of hierarchy and authority for campers and staff, clear expectations of moral behavior, and quasi-liturgical practices that come out in song and action. A normal day at camp is a mixture of order and freedom. The same activity periods obtain every day except for Sunday, though the campers have some freedom to choose what they'll actually do. Every morning after breakfast, the girls sit on the floor of the main lodge and sing for more than half an hour. Their songs range from the sweet and old-fashioned mountain greenery to the music of James Taylor and Carole King, to the Indigo Girls and even Taylor Swift. This repertoire is an index of the camp's chronological history. Many of the oldies are kept in circulation, but new songs are incorporated. Like any living tradition, the music at camp changes while retaining a core identity. Also among the camp's quasi-liturgies are Camp Christmas, ice cream at Odie's, Tadger Day, and other occasions that are more or less opaque to an outsider. Particularly affecting in this age of anything goes between boys and girls are the co-ed dances, which take place every Saturday night with Green Cove's brother camp, Mondamin, and which the older girls anticipate eagerly. Many boys and girls pair up at these dances, but not with any particular intensity since they see each other only once a week and are monitored by the counselors. They send letters back and forth by a mail delivery service called the Pony Express, and this takes nearly 4 days from door to door, despite the fact that the camps are located less than a mile from each other. The time frame allows for the letters to be monitored by the counselors who keep an eye on things, because you can imagine what might develop if they were not monitored. If a boy and a girl really like each other, they go to the seawall during the last co-ed to watch the sunset, and the boy may put his arm around the girl. Their friends sometimes watch the couples as they walk toward the seawall built on the lake's edge, and they might tease them gently as they return. All of it has a nostalgic feel. I detected lightness in my daughter's voice as she described her co-ed partner as a great guy who was sweet and fun, but she assured me that they were not in any kind of relationship. She seemed to wish that dating could be more like this in the world outside of camp. My daughter and her friends thrive within these constraints. Because no electronics are allowed, the girls are forced to play cards, talk, read, and write letters. Because they can't sit idle in their cabins, they must get out and try new activities. Because meals are served at set times, they must eat during meal times or not at all. Yet in the midst of all this structure and limitation, the girls want nothing more than to come back year after year, to see friends, to rise through the ranks to become counselors, and to send their own children to camp years later. The tradition of life at camp forms a central part of their identities, and their identities are communal. What I've described here is not as elevated as a religion. It is not as venerable as an intellectual or moral tradition. Nevertheless, the camp experience is bounded and visible. You can see it. You can go there and be part of it. It illuminates what I think all traditions offer to human beings. It requires what all traditions do, that we interact with other people who share our loves and inclinations. This doing with others happens not just once, but regularly, year after year. In corporate worship, in a college's ceremonial events, and even in the celebration of family birthdays, routine is not here a sign of failure, but an occasion for appreciation. At times like these, we see ourselves as members of communities who live in certain geographical places. The places themselves dictate the activities to a certain extent. The Blue Ridge Mountains, the church's sanctuary, the college campus. We are reassured by these familiar activities and places that not everything is in constant flux, that some things do not change or change only incrementally and only for good reason. At camp, a girl explained to me recently, I know things will be exactly the same as they were last summer, and that's what I want. When we perform ritual actions, the rituals form us in turn. Girls who sing and paddle canoes together form strong bonds of friendship and affection. The girl who climbs mountains, rides horses, and spends days in the woods with her peers learns that she can be self-sufficient and generous at once, that independence and care for others go together. These experiences also teach girls that they are capable of the same things as their male peers: climbing, sailing, mountain biking, mastering outdoor survival skills. Self-reliance has been taught in just this way to young women at Green Cove for more than 70 years. In this sense, the camp is conservative, not because it has anything to do with politics again, but because it conserves a way of life that was thought good in the 1940s and is still judged good today. As a camper from 1957 wrote recently about her experience there, she said, I had no idea how life-changing and life-saving it would be. Camp is with me all the time. Traditions like those at Green Cove offer a sense of self that is not based on a particular individual trait. At camp, girls cultivate identities that emerge in the interplay between themselves and a group. I am a person who does what these people do, a girl thinks. This unforced solidarity among campers is not a constraint, but a support. And it also shows the girls that certain modes of life are good, respectable, and praiseworthy. Clear paths are set before them. The first-year camper wants to be the senior camper. The senior camper wants to be the counselor. Equality is not the summum bonum. An acolyte is not a priest, and a counselor is not the head of camp. Hierarchy exists, and it is celebrated. Outside of camp, I think we see this kind of modeling when a young woman wants to be like her mother, or a young man like his father, a student like his teacher. Such emulation is often thought to be countercultural in our day, given that we're so often encouraged to pursue experiments in living by being different, creative, and always original. But roles exist for good reason. They embody virtues that many generations have seen as good, useful, perhaps transcendently fulfilling. And the idea that people normally inhabit particular roles over the course of a life, that traditions inhere not only in places such as camps and churches, but also in a single person's experience across time, is comforting. We do not stay 29 years old forever, but this is no tragedy. Good things come with age, new duties and responsibilities, new authority, new opportunities to love and care for others. If he is lucky, a young man may progress from son to husband, then to father and grandfather. Given these benefits, then, why are we so keen to destroy traditions? Why, in the words of Edward Shills, does modern culture appear to be a titanic and deliberate effort to undo by technology, rationality, and governmental policy the givenness of what came down from the past? Why do we so often think that to assume a role is to fail? I think the answer has much to do with our desire for absolute equality and our hatred of judgment. Yoram Hazony, a political philosopher from Jerusalem, has identified both constraint and honor as ideas that would help to revitalize lost or eclipsed traditions. Honor, of course, is accorded on the basis of judgments about merit and virtue, but judgments imply inequality. People are judged more or less worthy of honor on the basis of the choices they make and the lives they live. The father who stays present in his children's lives after a divorce is more honorable than the one who disappears. The man who tries earnestly to make his marriage work is more honorable than the one who quickly divorces. The person who works hard at something for years is more honorable than the one who cannot commit to anything. All of this is obvious, but I found that my students shy away from moral judgment, or at least they say they do. I'm sure none of you all in this room have ever said these phrases, but things like, you do you, I'm expressing my truth, you're good, and other facile evasions. But we adults have the same hesitancy. We don't want to make other people feel ashamed. People already know what they're doing, we rationalize, and we don't need to make things worse. We are sympathetic and want to be kind. But in truth, this is not always the better way. A well-intentioned public and private judgment, thinking of Augustine's benevolent harshness, provides guardrails for good behavior. It shows young people that not all behavior is equally praiseworthy and that some kinds of lives are objectively more fulfilling than others. Such judgments need not be hard-hearted and after the fact either. They're often best expressed in candid conversations about hypotheticals. Many years ago, and this is a true story, a college friend who was engaged to be married wondered aloud whether it might be okay to have one last fling before the wedding. I asked her how she might feel 30 years into married life if her husband turned to her and said how much he had valued her honesty from the outset of their relationship. She decided to forego the fling. Perhaps another reason for the contemporary rejection of tradition is our discomfort with both past and present. Many people have not forgotten or never learned how to enjoy an inheritance because we are also future-oriented. What can be improved or changed? Where will the next project appear? What new initiatives press upon us? We constantly judge our present experience to be unsatisfactory. We hope for something better sometime soon. But traditions, and I would certainly include the tradition of liberal learning in this, traditions do not look forward in this way. They preserve pastness and attempt to make the past live. This is the real function of liturgy, of the great books, of the classical violin repertoire, of museums, even of a family's Christmas morning routine. All these things deliver the past to us in the present, recalling what has gone before and what associations we've had. We're not the first people to live, they tell us. Patterns of conduct and virtue exist independently of any individual, and the most important parts of personal identity often emerge not as a result of private thinking, but in groups that do and love the same things. Living traditions like these depend on constraint and judgment. They embody codes of conduct in which both success and failure are possible. They reward hard work and consistency with hierarchies that give more honor to some and less to others. They often require apprenticeships, long spans of investment in a tradition before a person can be a full participant. These challenges actually heighten the value of traditions. People know that their places were not bought cheaply and that renunciation will have costs. Just as a bit of a coda, I returned to Green Cove this past summer because I'd been chosen to go on the mother-daughter hike with my 14-year-old. A few other 40-somethings and I showed up near the end of camp, and guides drove us high up into the Blue Ridge Mountains to a campsite where we pitched our tents. 2 enthusiastic and fit college-age counselors led the way, cooked for us, and generally took care of us. It was the first time I had returned to camp since being a counselor, and I rejoiced in feeling no different than I had at 20 years old. Other people might have aged, I recall thinking, but not me. I'm not so different from the counselors themselves. On the second afternoon's hike, down from a high lookout point, I twisted my ankle, tripped, and fell 10 feet down an incline. I knew immediately that I was hurt and that it wasn't just a sprain. After crawling back up to the trail, I called for help, and the counselors came with a first aid kit and wrapped my leg, which didn't help at all. We were about a mile out from the campsite, so I hobbled back, holding onto my daughter's shoulders and taking many breaks. I soaked my swollen ankle in icy creek water along the way, and I found out later that I had broken my leg, so it was quite painful. Of course, an episode like this could happen to anyone at any age. But as we made our way back to the campsite, I was struck by my sudden dependence on others who were much younger than I am. I saw myself through their eyes, and I realized that even though I vividly remembered being their age, they did not see me as their contemporary. I wasn't just like the counselors. I was a member of the older generation. I also saw how I, even though I spent a good amount of time thinking about traditions and the virtues of traditions, had bought into the notion that what is admirable is the future, the young, and the new. The young are beautiful, vibrant, capable, full of energy. They have their whole lives in front of them. That's basically all of Union over there. That's you guys. It is easy to admire this, and I was a bit envious, to be honest. We older people, have already made our choices. We're no longer so vibrant or so attractive, and we do not have so much of life ahead either. But I was also reminded that traditions, unlike the superficial public culture that surrounds us, actually establish significant places for people at every age. They offer work and responsibility appropriate to a person's experience. Some people serve as elder statesmen. Those in middle age do the hard work of conservation and maintenance. The children and young people are in training to inherit these institutions, if only we can keep them. Perhaps the greatest reward of growing older, then, is seeing a tradition preserved so it can benefit the generations that follow. In an environment that tends to value change and progress above all, this is no small task. It may require resistance and defense. But defense can't be our main task. Rather, we must show others how to love the traditions that we already do love and value. As Joseph Pieper has put it, the activity of the living transmission of a traditum is a highly dynamic business. Such transmission takes place only when we ourselves participate fully and joyfully. In our cultural moment, I think it's easy for those who value these kinds of traditions to despair. Much is against the preservation and cultivation of these kinds of traditions, but there really is work to do, and everyone in this room is doing it. Our task is to build and care for these institutions, classical schools, great books, charter schools, Christian and Jewish colleges and universities, churches and synagogues, neighborhoods, camps, and of course, families. And little of this most important work is done at an explicitly political level. I think the most important work takes place at camp and in places like it, unselfconsciously and with no mention of the word tradition. We do not need to tell anyone that we are conserving something valuable. We do not need to let slip that we are forming people, giving them a group, and saving them from alienation and loneliness. We can keep secret the idea that role models will benefit them as they grow older, that constraint, order, and judgment will not hurt them, but help them to flourish. We must merely go about our business with confidence, secure in the knowledge that traditions like these remain living possibilities and may yet serve as restorers of culture. Thank you.
Colleagues, we have a season of time available here to enlarge the conversation. We invite you, if you have questions to which you would like Elizabeth to address herself and comment upon, to come forward, please, to the microphones. This will enable that those who are in the back can hear, and that your questions and the responses are picked up by our videographer. So please, to the left or to the right, who would like to be first?
I know it's a little bit hard to raise a question about a story I just told. It's fixed, only just.
So while you are contemplating your forward motion to the microphone, I've got all sorts of questions. Elizabeth and I get to talk all the time, so I don't want this to become a dialogue between us. But one of the recurring thoughts that I had as you spoke was the timeliness of your remarks on the occasion of the canonization of John Henry Newman, who spoke so movingly about the idea, the university, and who is a great emissary on behalf of liberal learning. You've read his work, you appreciate it as well. Might you say something about him and the legacy that he has for us, and the ways in which your own reflections here on liberal learning have been influenced by, and in a way you're conserving that tradition?
Well, my dear dean here has put me on the spot to talk about Newman, who I haven't read in some years, but of course I have read The Idea of a University. Newman, in a way, was transmitted to me through the conduit of Michael Oakeshott, who also wrote a book called The Idea of Liberal Learning. And I think what is most important about that vision of liberal learning is that, of course, it is something that cannot be engaged in for these practical purposes that I have talked about in the essay. That it has a higher end, certainly philosophical and theological, in the idea of Newman. I think, though, everything in the modern day is pushing us away from that. And here I think Lewis is right. If you haven't read this little essay, Learning in Wartime, go and read it now. It is well worth your time, because the import of, or the takeaway from that essay is that there will always be things to prevent us from doing the kind of work that universities are meant to do. And everything is pushing universities to turn into things that they are not by design. And I think to the extent that we can read Newman or Oakeshott or Lewis or any of these people who have such a clear vision, it certainly will remind us of our most important work.
Lewis Pearson.
Thank you, Dr. Corey. My question is about supporting tradition, the financials, right? Where there's this constant pressure to make money. How do we supplant? I mean, I think it's necessary, but to bring to the table in a winsome way the fact that if money is for anything, it's for the liberation and flourishing of the human person. So how do we make that kind of argument that it's something that isn't supposed to be making money, but it's the place we're supposed to be spending our money?
Well, I do have some experience with people who are saying, that there is a vision of liberal learning here that I want to preserve and want to support. It's much easier to make a case to somebody for funding that when you say, well, I've got this path-breaking new research, and if you don't fund it, there will be a consequence to the world. It's compared to that, it's very hard to say, oh, well, liberal learning is very good for the souls of people, and therefore you should support it. In a certain sense, I think traditional understandings of learning will always be at a disadvantage in this environment. I also think that's because we are constantly thinking about practical outcomes, and you cannot say that the practical outcome you can't say what it will be. At the end of 4 years, this person is formed. Well, what does that mean exactly? And maybe the person doesn't see the benefit of the liberal education until 20 years later or 30 years later. I don't have a good answer for you, but I think one way of doing it is to say there are certain flourishing institutions, and actually some of you may know these schools, the Great Hearts Academies. They're in Texas and in Arizona. They have tremendous success in terms of not just the test scores, but the students speak so beautifully and so well. And I think there are certainly donors out there who are going to be attracted by that kind of output. But it's not certainly as enticing as some of the other more forward-looking projects.
I'm trying to take these comments in as a professor at University of Virginia in the philosophy department, and I'm trying to think about what it would mean for me to make myself more completely a member of the kind of community that you're describing, one that's somewhat analogous to the camp that you described. But my employer, I think, has something like the following picture of my assignment as a member of this community. I'll do the version that, it sort of is the analog in the camp. It would be as if they said to the counselors, what we want you to do is to spend very little time with the campers and to work in the privacy of your own cabin behind a locked door, and to prove to people at all the other camps that you're really awesome. If you do that, but don't really come through for our campers, we'll promote you. But if you focus on our campers and don't do the other thing, then you'll have to walk. So what I'm wondering is how radical a change in patterns of graduate education, job descriptions of professors, expectations of professors would be required in order to put this kind of community into place.
Yeah, well, there's almost no answer to that because, of course, you've described exactly what does happen. There's a certain way in which all of this, the camp is actually quite real. It goes on this way, and it is a living tradition, and people go back there, and the focus is, of course, on the campers, not on the other camps and the competition. I do think that there is a possibility of this kind of education taking place, especially at undergraduate institutions, and especially if I may hope that this is what we're doing in places like the Honors College at Baylor. We don't have any graduate education at all. The primary aim of the Honors College, and much of the rest of Baylor too, actually, is to focus on the students and on the campers. So our incentives are a little different. But of course, what you're saying is that has to come from above, because if you are being judged on, your competitiveness in the great world of the academy, you're right. There's no incentive at all to invest in this kind of a community. How we make that change happen, I don't know. Wise administration.
Hi, I'm Brad Agel from Brigham Young University, from the Marriott School of Business. So I'm one of the vocational folks. A wonderful talk, by the way. Thank you very much. I'm curious about a very practical issue that we're dealing with right now. Of course, more than anybody, business school, we get ranked. And we get ranked by a whole bunch of people. You may have recently seen that the Business Roundtable changed their idea of what business is about. So Business Roundtable is made up about 200 CEOs. They came out with a statement about 6 weeks ago, said, we reject the idea that the corporation's sole and main interest is shareholder value maximization, right? They said, nope, we think business, now we think it's about being good to the community, employees, et cetera, et cetera. However, if you look at the rankings of business schools, we get ranked on things like the salary of our incoming students versus the salary that they start when they leave, which pushes us to have as many students go to Wall Street as possible. And there's going to be a discussion in Davos in February about rankings and what they do to us. And I'm curious what ideas or what thoughts you would have. I'm going to Davos. What do we put in place of it?
Well, that's a tricky question. I mean, there's a certain way in which I guess I could get around that by saying, well, what I'm talking about here is not what business schools are doing. Now, there's a way in which, and I have a colleague in the business school who actually understands his job to be teaching economics or entrepreneurship in a way that is liberally based, or liberally great books based. So it is. I think it's possible, but to make that kind of transformation on the to a business school or to a school of engineering, I'm not sure it works as well. I think what I'm arguing for is that these schools go on, and they should go on, and they're very important, but that also there should be a place where the students are, they may well be business focused, but they could also take classes in Homer or Virgil and read those books. I don't think you're probably going to have a lot of luck reforming the rankings, and certainly in terms of salaries, because businesses are meant to make money.
But you fall into the shareholder value myth. Hopefully they're not just about making money. That's certainly not what I teach. That's certainly an important thing, because every business needs resources, but they need not only financial resources, they need human resources, natural resources. So I hope that business is not just about making money, but rather it is actually about creating value for all stakeholders.
Sure.
And we're trying to figure out how to get those who rank us to also somehow think in that same way.
But isn't that exactly what the Business Roundtable is trying to reorient?
It is.
Yeah, I mean,
right.
So in a way, they're already doing what you're asking for.
Right, but they haven't figured out the mechanisms.
No.
So anyway, I knew it was a really tough question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, Matthew Walls from the University of Dallas. I was very intrigued by your critique of the aspirational model, which I find to be almost the most subtle of the temptations of even good liberal arts schools.
Right.
But I also want to know, in relation to the analogy with the camp, what exactly the place of honor is in a true liberal education, and what notion of excellence should be at work there. My fear is that the camp analogy looks more like a family, and I'm not sure I'd want the place of liberal learning to be modeled simply on a family. That there is a place for honoring those who achieve and really pushing for excellence and rigor, that that some aspects of that aspirational model could maybe draw out.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you're making an argument, I mean, making a point that needs to be, that I should probably clarify, which is to say, in rejecting the aspirational model, I don't think I'm rejecting the idea that we ought to strive for excellence altogether. The difficulty, though, is that everything in contemporary culture, on my reading, pushes us toward this pursuing of excellence and not thinking about the intrinsic goods of the things we're doing. So, you know, if I could be known as an excellent person, I would rather, or as an amazing, you know, X or Y, I would much rather do that than, you know, study Proto-Corinthian pottery. So I don't think the danger here is that we forget the intrinsic goods, not that the desire for excellence is going to go away. The other thing I think about the question of excellence is that there are lots of different reasons for pursuing it. And it's very easy to fall into well, I want to be famous, or I want to be this or that. But there are other ways of conceiving excellence where you're actually motivated by a love of the work itself. So, you know, if you're a musician, you hear a fantastic recording of the Bach Goldberg variations, you say, I want to play that. I want to do that. That to me is a better model for, I want to do that because it is good and I see it as good and it's good in itself. And I want to be able to do that, than to say, I want to do that so I'll be the next Glenn Gould.
Hi, Carl Aho, formerly here, BU PhD 2016, currently at Tarleton State University, a school which is trying to follow in Baylor's footsteps in going to D1 athletics in order to strengthen our academics. So if you want to talk about rankings, come find me after the talk. I have thoughts. But about this talk, I love this talk. I feel very seen by this talk because two things are true. I love Joseph Pieper, and I love and am very formed by, and I'm definitely in education, hashtag because of camp, and I'm probably alive because of camp. So this talk is perfect for me, and I know camp has been a really powerful institution for a lot of people. And maybe I can just ask, I can do some amateur sociology. Show of hands, and this is not going to come across very well on the tape, I'm afraid. Show of hands, how many folks here are formed significantly by some kind of summer camp experience? I'm not a very good sociologist, but that's a lot of hands. So maybe I can invite some of, especially the younger folks who are formed by camp like me up here, because so far the people who love Joseph Pieper have been asking a lot of the questions, and I want to hear more from my fellow former camp counselors and lifeguards and every other job you do at the place. So with all that said, I'm going to ask a question about Pieper.
Okay, good.
I worry that camp actually isn't a great sort of Pieper-friendly institution. And here's why. One of the things I love most about Pieper is what he says, and philosophers are so rarely good at this, what he says about holidays. He writes really powerfully about shared holidays like Christmas. And he would be really aghast at some of the what I might characterize as fake holidays, National Hamburger Day or what have you. And I worry that camp holidays are closer to the fake holidays than they are to holidays like Christmas. At my camp, we had Christmas in July, and it was Christmas, but it was in July. It wasn't Christmas as such. It wasn't part of the liturgical calendar. It was an excuse to drink hot chocolate in July. And we got a few examples of Green Cove traditions in the talk, but most of them were ones that would be inscrutable to outsiders. And a lot of the traditions at my camp would have been inscrutable to outsiders also. So here's the question. Are camps getting people connected to these shared holidays that are so meaningful to a ton of people of the sort that Pieper recommends, or are camps inculcating us, informing us in some kind of private language that only camp people understand?
Good question. I was using camp more as a, trying to make a contrast between camp solidarity among people with common interests and radical individualism. The problem I worry about with many young people, students and my own children, is that they are being formed by things that are not communal in any way. And what is good about camps, the reason I chose the camp example, and also potentially about things like honors colleges and programs that are coherent, is that they are a group of people doing the same things and offering a kind of identity that's not simply individualistic. So I don't think camps could necessarily satisfy Pieper. I don't think that's not really my
I thought that was the point.
Not exactly. Okay.
I missed it then. I apologize. Thank you so much for a lovely talk.
Final question. Hi, Ben Lipscomb, Houghton College. I suspect that the vocational thing has been always thus. Thinking about the first medieval universities, that people went there because there was demand for clerks, and here's a way to serve them. I heard a lovely talk this afternoon by professors talking about teaching his students the virtue of studiousness through incorporating forms of liturgy and prayer into preparation for study. I'm wondering if you have thoughts about restrictive formative practices, since I think it's probably inevitable. Disagree with me if you want to, but I think it's probably inevitable that the students will always be coming for job training in some sense, alongside whatever liberal thing also happens. And so I'm wondering, with these external pressures that are just going to be there, how do we, through practices, direct people toward the internal goods, not just have them there and say, love this,
Right.
but nudge them that way?
Well, I think the most obvious or best way to do that is by modeling it for them in the classroom. I mean, I'm sure you all do this, and the students here hopefully are experiencing this kind of thing, that the classroom becomes a place where the career and the practical concerns are set aside for a time. They're never set aside completely because everybody wonders what the next step's going to be. But to the extent that a classroom can become almost a sacred place, and I don't mean religious per se, but a place where we say, okay, well, for a while, we're just going to read Plato, or we're just going to look at these images of art. And for that time, I think they can say, oh, there is a good here. Wow, I didn't know that. And they can take delight in the actual activity for its own sake. I also think the second part of that is to be in a community where other people are finding that out too. So to the extent that they can live together and have conversations about these deep and meaningful things that they're starting to realize are actually deep and meaningful, that is the kind of thing that I think will perpetuate what we're looking for. But of course, the concerns about career never go away. I mean, you can't, I'm not saying you can't worry about the vocational. I'm just saying that that's not exactly what the liberal part is about.
Please join me in thanking Elizabeth Corey.